In this tutorial we'll have a look at shapes. Shapes are used both in compositing and in colour grading, so we'll have a bit of a combined tutorial because there's quite a large amount of overlap. We can add shapes to any entity on the timeline, and with the exception of the colour correction tools, shapes always modify the alpha channels. In the case of colour correction, the shapes give us windows through which we can colour grade. To get at the shapes interface, we just double click any entity on the timeline, and down here choose shapes. If we do add a shape, we can see we get a little icon here on the clip in this instance to show us that we've got a shape active on here. If I clear it out, we can see it's gone. So we can add shapes to clips, but we can also add shapes to any other effect on the timeline also. So for example, this is adding a shape directly into the blur node, in which case the shape would modify the alpha channel of the output of the effect. So let's look at the shape interface. To create a shape, we simply choose Create Shape, which stays live until we start clicking, and we just click around our frame to create a shape. A double click will end the shape. In this particular version there seems to be an interface bug. This is in fact a closed shape. If we look at our alpha channel we can see, but the close isn't happening until I nudge on a frame. Looking at the shape itself, we can see it's made up of control points, which we can grab and move. The control points are green when they're not selected, and red when they're selected. We can select by clicking single points, or we can lasso to select multiple points, or we can double click any point to select the whole shape. With any part of a shape selected, parameters appear down here for the whole shape. So for example, the whole shape can be rotated or rotated around an offset point. We can insert additional points into our shapes from here. Just make live and select somewhere. You can keep adding points until you deselect insert point. Each point or any selection can be smooth or sharp, or it can have connected tangents where both halves of the tangent stay in a straight line, so you get a smooth shape through a point, or independent tangents where each side can be positioned independently. When we first draw a shape, we can see there are in fact three lines, being the edge of the shape, inner softness and outer softness. The default amount of softness that we have when we create a shape is this value here, and this value is only used when we create a new shape or when we reset some points, so changing it now won't make any difference. To change the softness in a point, we can select a point or multiple points or the whole shape, and we can slide by clicking down and dragging the width parameter here. So this is now creating a softness around this point, and if I look at my alpha channel in this case, we can see it's creating a blur on that shape. We have full control over the softness. Apart from setting the width of the softness, we can also say, again by dragging this function up and down, where the center of that softness is. And in fact, with connected and independent tangents, we actually get a tangent for the softness as well. There are a number of options to reset the settings to do with the shapes. Reset tangents restores the tangents to a default position, which if we're on independent tangents will be the tangents pointing directly at the next control point. If we were on connected tangents, the reset would be to straight line through the current control point to get a smooth direction change with our shape. Likewise, the radials are the tangents that go out to control the softness, so we can reset the radials, and that will in fact take them back to the default softness set here. And with the direction of the radials being perpendicular to the main tangent. We can also just reset the angle of the radial. So these are the principal controls that allow us to set our shape exactly as we would like. In this section here we have controls that enable us to say how our shape works within our environment. Where we're compositing, we can say what we're going to do with the alpha channel that's already coming in. In this case we're going to say clear, so you'll see that the only thing on the alpha channel is the shape that I've drawn. Now if I just lose this for the time being, go back to seeing our video picture, go back to our timeline, I'm going to just roughly create an alpha channel using the green screen function here. So we've now got an alpha channel based on our green screen. So with our green screen effect selected, in other words we're going to add a shape to the green screen, we can see how the other options work for our input alpha. Now you can see that if I leave this on clear and started to draw a shape, immediately the existing alpha channel disappears because we told it to clear it. Just take that back down to normal. Alternatively, I could say to keep the existing alpha channel so that my shapes modify what's there, or to invert it, or to completely fill it with white if it was totally empty. The input alpha control is only relevant when we're using the shapes for compositing. It's not relevant when we're using the shapes for color correction. The shape combine option gives us some choices about how different shapes relate to each other, and also to any input alpha channel. At the moment it's on add, so if I create a shape, we can see that it's adding more to the alpha channel that we've already got. Alternatively, I could put it onto subtract. So it's now clearing out the alpha channel. As inverted, we'll fill the outside of our shape. Whereas intersect will make an alpha channel where all shapes or alpha channels overlap. It's quite useful for garbage matting. The shape combine either works with alpha channels coming into the effect, as I'm using here, or it also works with multiple shapes. So let's just lose the green screen for a second and go back to our blank shape. We'll clear our alpha channel and add a shape just as a starting point. So I've added this shape, so we can see obviously we've added this. If I then go on to add another shape, at the moment they're both on add, so we've created a single alpha channel based on multiple shapes. But if I were to double click this second shape to select the whole thing, I could then say that actually I'd like to see the intersection between those two shapes, and that would be the alpha channel that's created, or in the case of color correction would be the area through which we're color correcting. Or I could subtract one from the other. So we can have any number of shapes built up on the same screen, and these functions choose how they interact with each other. Just going to delete these down. If we're color correcting through shapes, as I mentioned, this has no purpose. On the other hand, this section is only related to color grading through shapes and has no purpose in compositing. Let's just set up a color grade. So I'm just going to add the RGB color corrector and double click it. So now I'm going to be adding shapes to the RGB correct. And remember, as I said at the outset, this is the only effect that behaves differently. You see, if I go to shapes and I add a shape, on every other effect it would have created an alpha channel. On the color correct it does not, for the reason it's actually used internally within the color corrector. If I now go to the color corrector and go to the first vector and make a change, of course it goes over the whole shot, but if I press this button, Win Shape, it's now only color correcting inside our shape. And in fact we can have multiple shapes working with multiple different free vector levels. So for example, if I go back to shapes and add a second shape, we can see that we are color correcting through this shape as well. But what I could do in my color corrector is if I added a second vector, so it's now V2, we'll make this one blue and make this go through the shapes. What we can do is, as we select the shapes, we can choose which vector each shape is related to using this control. So free vector layer, put onto vector 2. So you can now see that this shape is being color corrected by vector 2, whereas this shape is being color corrected, if I double click it, by vector 1. So go back to the color corrector and we can see on vector 2 we're grading in this shape, and on vector 1 we're grading in that shape. So this is pretty much the only difference between using shapes for color grading and shapes for compositing. How we create shapes and how they interact with each other is all identical. It's just a choice here, if we're color grading, that allows us to assign a particular shape to a particular free vector. And we know that when the shapes are directly added to a color corrector, the alpha channel remains unaffected. We can animate the shapes simply with these functions here. So with auto key off, wherever I make a move, no new keyframes are being added. So you can see no animation has been created if I move these around, until I explicitly add a keyframe, in which case I can create animation of the shape. If I have auto keyframe on, then every time I make a move or make a shape change, then a keyframe is automatically inserted for me. You'll notice that unlike the curves parameter, keyframes are not being marked on here. So to locate your keyframes, use the previous and next functions here. When you're on a frame that has a keyframe, the shape itself goes yellow. You can obviously delete keyframes also. The delete, cut all, copy all and paste all are methods that allow us obviously to delete shapes, but also to cut the shapes from one effect onto another. For example, it might be that I started to draw this shape on the color corrector level, but actually that was an error, I didn't want to do that, in which case I can double click the shape to select it, cut it all, go to the main clip layer and paste all. So it's a method that allows us to move shapes around from one layer to another. We'll have a full tutorial on motion tracking, but just as a quick how-to in terms of how to motion track a shape if we want to. On this particular interface, the shapes themselves don't track, but we can modify their position and animate them to change shape. So, let's say for example, we wanted to do an animated map for his face. So with auto key on and starting with a smooth move, I'll hit create shape and just loosely make our shape around his face, his head rather. So I've now created a shape. You can see the shape's gone yellow. That indicates that a keyframe exists there. So of course now we have a shape, but it's static. It's not going anywhere. So if I were going to motion track this, then as I say, we'll have a full tutorial on tracking, so I won't go into too much detail, but the process generally is that you would go into the tracking interface, select a point to track the shape, and then within the motion tracking interface what you've basically got is a set of data that's free floating, and you tell it where you want to send that data. And in this case, you'll see that the parameters for the shape that I had selected are still up. So I just say that I want to send the motion tracking data there, and I want to send movement information. So now having done that, we'll see that our shape is at least moving exactly as the tracking point was. But of course, in this particular application that's not particularly helpful because he's changed the angle of his face, so the shape needs to change. But fortunately the motion tracking data and the shape animation data are unrelated. So if I go to a point where he's more square on, at this point I could start making some changes to the shape, because this shape change that I'm doing is also animating on top of the motion tracking. So it's just a case of adding in perhaps enough keyframes just to maintain our shape. If we have a very complex shape to track and to rotoscope, it's certainly possible to create complex shapes. Personally, I prefer to break an object down into smaller objects, where those smaller objects perhaps are easier to animate a shape around. I've got an example next on the timeline, which is this particular shot here, where my client decided that I only needed half a green screen, and in fact I needed to mat him for considerably longer into the shot. So in this instance what I did was, you can see I've created multiple shapes for objects that don't in themselves change shape that much. So just the head, just the body, one leg at a time. Because if you do one leg at a time, it makes it a lot easier to deal with the crossovers and the changing shapes and the gaps that appear between them. Then each individual shape is then motion tracked to give me a good starting point. So then in fact, having taken the original clip, I've then cropped the shot using a crop edge, and then the crop color has been set to match the green screen. And then I've just used a composite node to use the shape that I've created to cut him back over the green screen, which then in the future process allows me just to do a normal green screen key for the whole shot, rather than worrying about which shot is on a green screen and which is not.